Seeds of a Silent Revolution. December 1944. The Ardennes forest is buried under snow. Bitter winds sweep across the ridges, numbing soldiers on both sides. The German army is preparing for its last great gamble in the west, the counteroffensive that would later be called the Battle of the Bulge. At dawn on December 16th, more than 200,000 German troops and nearly 1,000 tanks surge forward through the quiet, wooded hills of Belgium and Luxembourg. The offensive catches the Allies off guard. American lines are pushed back, villages fall one by one, and panic spreads through forward units. But on the northern shoulder of the attack, near a stretch of high ground known as Elsenborn Ridge, the Americans are preparing something the Germans have never encountered. Inside ordinary-looking artillery shells is hidden a secret developed in laboratories across Britain and the United States, a secret that had been kept under the tightest security. The weapon is not a new tank, nor a rocket, nor a bomb. It is a fuse that does not wait to strike the ground, a fuse that can sense its target, a fuse that turns the sky into a killing zone. This device is known as the proximity fuse, or in US terms, the variable time fuse. To the men who built it, it was one of the greatest scientific achievements of the war, second only to the atomic bomb. To the men who would soon face it on the battlefield, it would be a nightmare. The science behind it was deceptively simple. A tiny radio transmitter and receiver, ruggedized to survive the enormous acceleration of being fired from a gun barrel, was fitted into the nose of an artillery shell. As the shell flew, the transmitter sent out radio waves. When those waves bounced back from a solid object, such as the ground or a cluster of enemy soldiers, the returning signal triggered the explosive. Instead of waiting to strike the earth, the shell would detonate at the precise height where its fragments would be most lethal. For decades, artillery had been limited by the problem of timing. Time fuses could be set, but only with guesswork and calculations, often producing shells that exploded too early or too late. Impact fuses were reliable, but the explosion was mostly wasted into the ground. The proximity fuse solved this problem once and for all. It created an airburst, a detonation that showered fragments downward over a wide area. Against troops in the open, there was no defense. Trenches, foxholes, even thick coats and helmets offered little protection from steel raining from above. Yet the Allies had been hesitant to use it. There was always the fear that a dud might land intact, allowing the Germans to capture the technology, copy it, and use it against Allied aircraft or ground forces. For that reason, the fuse had been employed mostly at sea, in naval anti-aircraft guns, where unexploded shells would sink beneath the waves and remain out of enemy hands. On the battlefield, its use was forbidden. But war rarely respects prohibitions. By December 1944, the Allied High Command faced the gravest crisis since Normandy. Hitler's counteroffensive threatened to split the Allied armies in two. Roads were clogged with retreating units, supply lines were under attack, and entire divisions were in danger of encirclement. In the snow-covered hills of Belgium, American commanders realized that conventional methods might not be enough. They turned to the weapon they had been told not to use. Artillery officers began issuing proximity-fused shells to their batteries. Orders were short and direct. These rounds explode above the enemy. Use them. Few gunners understood the details. They only knew that their shells, when fired, were supposed to burst in the air rather than on the ground. The first salvos were fired at German infantry advancing through forest clearings. What followed was unlike anything the enemy had ever seen. Instead of exploding harmlessly into the frozen soil, the shells detonated in midair, spraying lethal fragments across entire formations. Soldiers who thought they were safe in ditches or behind tree trunks were suddenly struck from above. Columns that had moved confidently through the snow dissolved into chaos. Survivors screamed and scattered. Officers struggled to restore order. For the first time in the war, German troops were experiencing the full force of modern, electronically triggered airbursts. Reports from American forward observers were almost incredulous. They described seeing whole groups of Germans vanish under a single burst. "They're dropping by the dozen," one noted. Another observer reported that German companies were cut to pieces before tanks could even be brought up in support. On the German side, confusion reigned. Some believed they were under air attack. Others whispered that the Americans were using gas shells or new types of rockets. Nobody could explain why the old methods of protection, digging in, spreading out, staying low, no longer seemed to work. In the freezing forests of the Ardennes, the rules of survival had changed overnight. The results were immediate and devastating. At Elsenborn Ridge, where American artillery units were reinforced and well supplied, wave after wave of German attacks was shattered by proximity-fused shells. Entire battalions were pinned down, unable to advance through the rain of fragments. The 6th Panzer Army, assigned to spearhead the offensive in the north, expected to smash through quickly. Instead, its progress stalled. The timetable of the German operation, already tight, began to slip. Every hour lost in the Ardennes was a step closer to failure. The Americans knew it. The Germans felt it. The proximity fuse had arrived on the battlefield, and it was tilting the balance of power. Chapter 1 closes on this moment of revelation. The German army had entered the Ardennes with confidence, hoping to break the Allied line and turn the tide of war. Instead, they encountered a silent revolution hidden inside a simple artillery shell. In the battles that followed, proximity fuses would not just kill thousands. They would shatter German morale, cripple attacks, and prove that technology as much as manpower could decide the fate of nations. Chaos of the Ardennes storm. The Ardennes offensive raged with brutal intensity. Snow fell heavily on the thick forests, muffling the sound of boots and engines, but nothing could hide the thunder of artillery. German commanders had promised their soldiers a rapid advance, a lightning thrust that would smash through the American lines and roll west toward the Meuse. Instead, they were walking into a storm unlike anything they had ever endured. At Elsenborn Ridge, the Americans had dug in. Their positions were primitive, shallow foxholes carved into frozen ground, but what mattered was the firepower behind them. Hundreds of guns, carefully positioned and stocked with ammunition, were waiting for the order to unleash hell. And this time, the shells were not ordinary. They carried the proximity fuse, the invention that turned the very air above the battlefield into a killing zone. The first German waves approached cautiously. Infantry columns stretched across snowy meadows and narrow forest tracks. They had been told that American resistance would be light, that artillery fire could be endured as it had been in battles before. But when the opening salvo came, it was different. The explosions did not erupt in the soil or smash harmlessly into the trunks of pine trees. They detonated high above, in perfect patterns of timed destruction. The bursts shredded entire groups, raining jagged steel fragments down from the sky. Men who instinctively threw themselves to the ground found no safety there. The air itself seemed lethal. German survivors would later recall the terrifying feeling that no position was safe, no ditch deep enough, no tree strong enough to block the deadly rain. Entire companies vanished in minutes. Officers shouted for men to press forward, but the paths ahead were littered with broken bodies, rifles scattered in the snow, helmets split open by invisible shards. The psychological shock was immense. For years, German infantry had trusted their training. They had endured barrages on the Eastern Front, survived Allied bombing raids, and fought through the hedgerows of Normandy. But this was something entirely new. Soldiers whispered to one another that the Americans were using some kind of mystery bomb or experimental gas. Others were convinced invisible aircraft were dropping explosives. Confusion spread more quickly than orders. By the second day of the offensive, some units flatly refused to advance across open ground, knowing what awaited them overhead. American observers stationed on the ridge watched in silence. Through binoculars, they could see enemy troops scatter, bunch together, then scatter again as another salvo struck. One officer described the effect in his report as entire enemy formations erased in front of my eyes. The artillerymen themselves had no time for reflection. They worked mechanically, ramming shell after shell into hot barrels, pulling lanyards, adjusting range. The proximity fuse did the rest. Each detonation was a scythe cutting through the massed enemy ranks. The German 6th Panzer Army, tasked with breaking through in the north, faced the brunt of this onslaught. Its timetable depended on rapid infantry advances to secure key roads. But instead of speed, it encountered slaughter. Hours were lost regrouping shattered battalions. Tanks, meant to roll forward once the infantry cleared the way, were forced to halt, waiting for gaps that never opened. The rhythm of the offensive faltered. Every delay meant American reinforcements had more time to arrive, more time to dig in, more time to prepare counterattacks. In the forests and villages near the ridge, the scenes were apocalyptic. Snow mixed with blood, tree branches splintered by airbursts rained down like spears, and the cries of the wounded echoed through the frozen night. German medics worked frantically, dragging men into makeshift shelters, but there were never enough stretchers, never enough bandages, never enough time. Command posts tried to reorganize shattered regiments, but communications were breaking down. Radio operators called for artillery support of their own, only to find that American guns already had the range and were silencing German batteries before they could respond. The transformation of the battlefield was unmistakable. In earlier campaigns, German troops had relied on momentum. Even under fire, discipline and coordination could carry them forward. But now, the more tightly they moved, the worse the destruction. The proximity fuse punished concentration, punished movement, punished the very tactics that the German command had planned to use. The result was paralysis. By the third day of the offensive, the name Elsenborn Ridge meant one thing in German field reports: immovable resistance. Again and again, attacks were ordered, and again they ended with soldiers pinned down, too terrified to cross open ground. The ridge itself became a fortress of artillery, and the German timetable collapsed under the weight of mounting casualties. For the Americans, it was a grim but undeniable victory. In the freezing Foxholes, infantrymen could hear the screams of German wounded carried by the wind after every barrage. They knew the shells above were changing the battle. Commanders reported with satisfaction that the new fuses had broken up wave after wave of enemy assaults. What had once been a desperate defensive stand was turning into a line the Germans could not break. And so the Ardennes storm, designed by Hitler to split the Allies, was already losing momentum. At Elsenborn Ridge, the future of the offensive was being decided not by tanks or infantry, but by invisible radio signals inside tiny fuses. The Germans had not expected this. They had never imagined artillery shells that exploded with such precision above their heads. In the chaos and snow of December 1944, they were learning the hard way that technology could be as decisive as courage. Aftermath and legacy. When the smoke began to clear in the frozen forests of the Ardennes, the German dream of a decisive breakthrough was already dying. The Battle of the Bulge would continue for weeks, and the fighting would remain brutal until January 1945. But the failure to pierce the northern shoulder at Elsenborn Ridge marked a turning point. The Wehrmacht had thrown its best units into the offensive, including armored divisions once considered the pride of Germany, but without infantry momentum, without the ability to seize the roads guarded by American artillery, the entire plan unraveled. For the men who survived the barrages, the memory was unforgettable. German veterans would later recall the helplessness of facing shells that seemed to burst out of nowhere. They spoke of comrades cut down without warning, of columns disintegrating under invisible fire, of the realization that traditional battlefield instincts no longer applied. For years, a soldier had known that the ground was his ally. Dig deep, press close to the earth, and you might survive. But with the arrival of proximity fuses, the very air had become a weapon. Safety had vanished. American officers, reviewing the results after the battle, were astonished by the effectiveness of the new technology. Reports circulated describing how entire attacks had been broken apart by only a handful of salvos. One officer remarked that the fuses had been worth their weight in gold. Another declared them the most important artillery development since the invention of gunpowder. These were not exaggerations. The data spoke for itself. Where proximity fuses were used, German casualty rates were catastrophic, and their ability to maneuver collapsed. The gamble of deploying such a secret weapon on land had paid off. Despite initial fears that unexploded shells might be recovered, the urgency of the Ardennes battle justified the risk. In practice, the Germans never managed to capture and reverse engineer the technology in time to make a difference. By the time they understood what they were facing, the battle was lost and the war itself was entering its final months. The impact went beyond the tactical victories in Belgium. Strategically, the failure of the Ardennes offensive sealed Germany's fate in the West. Instead of dividing the Allied front, The offensive drained the last reserves of the Wehrmacht. Thousands of irreplaceable troops were lost, tanks destroyed, supplies consumed in a futile push. When spring came, the Allies would advance into Germany itself against an enemy that no longer had the strength to resist. And among the many reasons for that collapse was the artillery technology that had ripped apart German formations in December snows. The proximity fuse also shaped the future of warfare. It represented one of the first truly smart munitions, a weapon that used sensors to determine the optimal moment to strike. In the years after the war, the principle was refined and expanded. Air defense systems, anti-missile weapons, even modern guided bombs all owe something to the breakthrough of 1944. Military planners realized that technology could multiply the power of existing weapons in extraordinary ways, and armies around the world began to invest heavily in electronic warfare, sensors, and precision systems. But for the soldiers who faced it for the first time, the memory was less about science and more about survival. Imagine standing in a snow-covered field, hearing the distant boom of American guns, then watching as the sky above you suddenly erupts in a rain of steel. There is no time to react, no chance to hide. The air is filled with splinters moving faster than the eye can follow. In seconds, entire squads are gone. Survivors hug the ground, shaking, waiting for the next burst. That was the reality on the northern flank of the Bulge. The Germans had laughed at American reliance on logistics and technology earlier in the war. They had believed that superiority came from discipline, from aggression, from the will to fight. Yet in the Ardennes, they were confronted with the fact that technology could be decisive. No matter how brave the assault troops, no matter how determined their officers, there was no answer for shells that burst in the air, triggered by invisible radio waves. It was a moment of rude awakening, a glimpse of the future of combat. For the Americans, there was pride, but also a sobering recognition of what they had unleashed. The proximity fuse was a triumph of Allied science and industry, but it was also a reminder of the devastating efficiency with which war consumes human life. Commanders reported success in breaking up attacks, but their diaries often spoke of the eerie silence after barrages, the knowledge that hundreds of men lay broken in the snow because of a device no larger than a flashlight hidden inside a shell. The legacy of that winter endures. Historians still debate whether the Battle of the Bulge could have gone differently if the proximity fuse had not been deployed. Some argue the Americans would have held Elsenborn Ridge with conventional artillery and infantry determination. Others insist that without the fuses, the Germans might have achieved a breakthrough, perhaps prolonging the war and changing the post-war balance. What is not debated is the fact that proximity fuses inflicted enormous losses, shattered morale, and helped stop the offensive cold. As the snow melted in early 1945, the Allies advanced eastward. German prisoners, trudging into captivity, spoke bitterly of the American guns, of shells that seemed guided by fate itself. They had faced tanks, planes, and bombs before, but nothing had terrified them quite like the invisible menace above their heads. The story of the Battle of the Bulge is one of courage and sacrifice on both sides. It is also a story of innovation, of how a small piece of electronic genius altered the course of a campaign and perhaps shortened the war. The proximity fuse was not as famous as the atomic bomb, nor as dramatic as the Normandy landings, but in its own way, it was just as decisive. It showed that even in the darkest winter of the conflict, science could tilt the balance. And so, in those frozen days of December 1944, as men fought and died in the snow, a silent revolution took place. The Germans had come expecting to break the American line. Instead, they discovered that the very sky had been turned into a weapon against them. Entire formations were wiped out, not by the weight of numbers, but by the precision of invisible signals inside artillery shells. That was the shock of the proximity fuse. That was the moment when technology revealed its true power on the battlefield.